What's up everybody, it's Brad here, and I'm coming at you with another instructional video today on how to install the Apex Tactical Flatty trigger for the Smith and Wesson M&P 2.0 pistols. And more specifically, I will be installing this kit on a M&P 2.0 optics ready pistol that came without the thumb safety. So if you have a similar pistol, hopefully this will help you install the Apex trigger on your setup. So go prop up your phone on your workbench, pause it when you need to, and follow along, and let's get this trigger installed. I totally upgraded my tripod setup, which is awesome because it clears my whole elbow space. Before, I used to have the tripod like right here in front of me, so I was working around it the whole time, and I think this should help get this video going much smoother. I know there's a lot of videos out there that have to do with the installation of these Apex triggers, but what's one more, right? I hope this helps you in some way. Maybe I do it a little bit differently than somebody else, so let's get right to it. So the first things first is I'm going to start by removing all of the accoutrements, I guess, the attachments. This is just an empty magazine, Floyd's Custom Shop, extended base plate. And this gun is obviously safety checked and cleared. You want to do that first. I'm going to remove my X300 light from the frame. Use a penny for that. Okay, that's out of the way. Now I'm going to remove the slide from the frame. We could set the frame aside. We'll get to that second. I'm going to remove the guide rod and barrel. Set those aside. Now, this one is an optics ready slide, M&P 2.0 optics ready slide. And so first I have to remove the Trijicon RMR here. This is a, let's see, T10 little bolt, and then I have my Brownells Magnetip screwdriver that I'll be using to remove this. One screw. Second screw. The optic comes right off. I'm gonna replace the battery on this before I put it back on. Let's set that aside. This next part is rather critical. This little plate here underneath the optic is what Smith and Wesson puts on their slides now to keep the safety plunger, which is this little button right here, secured. So the new Apex kit comes with a polished safety plunger, so you need to remove this. Now, this is very hard to remove, and that's where this comes in. This is the Dynamite 0.050 inch Allen head. And this should do the trick, just like that. So if you're going to do this yourself and you have an optics ready pistol, get yourself one of these Dynamite Allen heads on Amazon and save yourself a headache. So you want to keep your finger kind of down on this because it is under spring tension, and don't lose the little screw. So I'm going to set the screw aside. I have my little tray here, Sage and Baker little parts tray, so I'm going to put it in there, and so it's safe and sound. And the spring here is attached on a little nub on the bottom of this plate, and I'm actually going to reuse this spring. The Apex spring is a little bit stiffer actually than the stock spring. So if you want a lighter trigger pull, retain the factory spring with the safety plunger. Now that you have that little plate removed, it just should fall right out, or you can just push on it a little bit and it comes right out. So here is the factory safety plunger. This one's been shot maybe 1,000 rounds through it. And here is the Apex polished safety plunger. You can see the edges are just so much smoother, nicer. And you just drop it right back in. And you grab the plate with, I'm using the stock spring. You can use whatever you want. And I'm going to, you know what, just for kicks, I'm going to use one of my little Hoppies lubricated field wipes, and I'm going to lubricate this spring and safety plunger before I put it back in. Little thin coating of oil. Drop it in there with the spring. Okay. I've got a rag here and the tiny little screw and a little bit of blue Loctite. And I'm going to put a little blue Loctite on the tiny little screw and then thread it in. I don't know the inch-pound setting for this little screw. Got a little Loctite on my hand. And so I'm just going to do it good and tight, as they say. Gonna put it on the end of my little tool here, push it down with one hand and thread it in with the other. So I'm holding it with my fingernail and I'm threading it in from the top. There we go. And give it a little torque, and it is all polished and that part's done. I would feel a little remiss if I didn't discuss how much easier it is with an optics ready pistol if you have the right tool. It's really difficult if you don't, because these sights on these Smith and Wessons are extremely hard to move. They press them in at the factory, I believe, with a machine, and they just are incredibly hard to remove. And if you don't have the right tools to remove the sight to get to the safety plunger, then you're gonna have all kinds of headaches. I have one of these. This is the MGW Sight Pro, and it's basically the best sight pusher money can buy. It's not cheap. You could buy another Smith & Wesson pistol for the price that you'll end up paying for one of these, but this does make quick work of removing the rear sight to put in that safety plunger. So hopefully your local gunsmith has one of these, and maybe he'll only charge you a couple bucks to move the sight to the side to get the safety plunger in. If you don't, then head over to Brownells, buy one of these, and you will thank me later. While I have the optic off, I'm going to replace the battery. So out with the old, in with the new. And I have this is a CHP WS, I believe they call it, optics plate for this. And it actually fills in the gaps really nicely on the top of this optic. As you can see, it fills in those voids, and it's metal instead of the factory plastic. I'm going to put a little blue Loctite on these threads for the optic and get the optic mounted back on. There's probably a inch-pound torque setting for these screws, and it's probably about 18 inch-pounds, but I didn't look it up. I just did it good and tight and not overly tight. A lot of people, they'll do is they'll use a little white tipped marker and mark the screw and the top of the optic. I think that's a good idea. I don't have one of those right now on hand, but I plan to do that. And that just makes sure that those don't start to spin out on you while you're shooting your pistol. So I'm just going to put some oil on the barrel before I put it back in. I haven't cleaned this pistol since the last time I shot it. You can see it's got all kinds of gunk and stuff on the barrel ramp here. Cleaning it up a little bit with these Hoppy's lubricated wipes. A little oil on the barrel always helps. I'll put a little oil on my guide rod too, just a thin coat of oil. Why not? All right. Get my little rag, wipe off the excess oil, and the top half of this install is done and ready to rock and roll. Apex has a chart of all the different spring differences and how it'll change the pull weight of the stock versus the stock springs, etc. And basically, if you stick with all of the factory springs, you'll end up with the lightest trigger pull. And my plan is to do just above the lightest trigger pull. So I will swap out the sear spring, which is this little guy. Not the green one, but that little guy there. The sear spring, the unpainted one, I'm gonna swap it out with that, and then keep the factory trigger return spring, and it should end up with about a 4.5 pound trigger. The first step to the frame is it has 3 pins. There's one here, and one back here. And you want to remove all of them from this side. And the main reason for that is this pin here is kind of like a flathead. It has a large flathead on this side, but on this side it doesn't. So you want to drive all 3 pins out from this side. And that's what we're going to do right now. So I have here, this is a 3/32 punch that I'm using for some of the springs. And I'm using this Wheeler block here so that the pins have somewhere to go as you're driving them through. Make sure that your takedown lever is positioned just like that, because if it swings like this or too much like this, it kind of blocks those pins and it can become kind of problematic. Now I like to use just a punch, and I will come in from the back here and use the punch to basically pull up on this forward block and remove it. Now your slide stop release lever just comes right out. Set it aside. Now you're going to work on these rear frame rails, and I just use my punch again and stick the punch under there and lift up against the frame rails and pull it out. It's under a little bit of tension. There we go. And the trigger will just come right out. You can set that down, and then set the sear housing block, just set it aside. Now you're ready to work on them. So this part is important. If you look here, this little doodad needs to be in that orientation when you put it back, and it engages with the sear. You could see there is the sear, and it engages in this little U-shaped piece, and this piece gets replaced as well as the sear, and I'm going to be replacing the spring that's underneath the sear as well. So you want to get a little bit smaller punch. This is a 1/16 punch, and don't mess with this pin down here. You're just basically going to start pushing this through. But keep in mind that the sear has a little spring right here underneath the sear, and it's under spring tension. You can see I'm pushing on it right now. It's under spring tension. So you want to kind of put your finger on top of the sear while you push this pin through. And it doesn't take any effort. I mean, it slides through super, super easily. And once you get it out far enough, I'm just going to take it all the way out. The sear and everything just pops right up. I'm getting the apex parts ready by just applying a little bit of oil with the Hoppy's lubricated field wipes to the parts. And then here is the apex spring that's unpainted, and I'm going to be replacing the factory spring with that. So I'm just going to lift the sear out, set it aside, lift out the little doodad, I don't know what else to call it, and set it aside. And this little plunger and spring should just come right out if you give it a little tap. Here is the factory spring, which is yellow, a tiny little plunger. You can set the factory spring aside. Grab the apex spring and put it back into its little home. It's a little hole there in the block. Push down on it, make sure it's engaging and feeling good. All right. So the apex sear has a little dog leg, and it will go down into the block just with the dog leg facing this way. And this little doodad basically will fit onto that dog leg just like that. And you will start from the front and push it back on until the holes all line up, and it will look like that. Once you have all the holes lined up and you could feel the spring tension, you can use your little punch to align everything. There it is. Now it's basically being held by the punch, and then take your pin and replace your punch. And you should be able to push it through by hand without using a hammer or anything like that. Just like that, it is all swapped out. Make sure that you feel that spring tension with your finger. And now here is the factory sear and the factory little sear engagement thing. I think it's important to talk about the trigger spring. Now it's shaped, has a fat end and a small end. The fat end will go eventually into the new apex trigger and will be retained by the trigger pivot pin. The other part of the spring gets hooked onto this little loop right here. And once we replace the trigger itself, I will show you how that's oriented, but basically when it's done, eventually, here is the trigger bar, the spring will be hooked on that loop with the opening facing up. Now I'm going to remove the trigger itself. I hate these little hingy triggers. I really prefer the flat face triggers, and even the new triggers that Smith & Wesson is producing now for their pistols are way better. So I like to set the trigger on the side of the block here and so that this bar has somewhere to hang out, because otherwise it's up like this. And so I like to do that, set it on the edge, and then you want to drive that pin out. Okay. And the trigger bar just comes right out. It's important to note the orientation of the trigger bar so you don't put it on the trigger wrong. So if the trigger is facing this way, like you're gonna pull the trigger like this, you want the bar to be facing down like this, and it'll fit in the side of the apex trigger like that. These apex trigger pins are actually really, really tight. So the next step, if you don't have a bench vise, you can certainly just try to use a punch or a hammer, brass hammer, to try to pound it in. But I like to use my bench vise. So I'm gonna move over there and press this bar onto the trigger. I'm going to start by using just some cardboard here. I've got my Dr. Pepper cardboard, and I'm going to insert it into my vise so I don't mar up the trigger. And then I'm going to set the trigger into the vise and just tighten it up until it has pressure and holds it in place. Then I'm going to basically orient the trigger bar correctly like I showed. And I am going to start tightening the pin with the vise. And once it starts, you can kind of feel it give. You want to keep moving the trigger bar up and down to make sure that it is engaged with that pin. So now let me loosen it and show you. I've been basically moving it like this, and it's captured, but it's not pushed all the way in. So it's on there. You can see it's swinging freely. It's oriented the correct way. And now I just have to continue to tighten it all the way on. It's nice and flush on this side, and it still is moving freely on the pivot pin. I ended up applying some of this Hoppy's gun grease just inside here because it was just having a little bit of friction. I didn't like it, so I put some of that grease in there, and now it's free as a bird. Next, I'm going to be installing the trigger return spring. Remember, I said the fat end with the bigger loop goes into the trigger like this, and the smaller end gets hooked with the opening facing upward. So I like to use some small needle nose pliers to grab onto it and hook. I'm gonna hook it this way, sorry. I'm gonna hook it on. See, I did it the wrong way already. Like that. There. So if you could see, the opening is facing up, and then the fat end will drop down into the trigger itself and will get captured by the trigger pin. So now it's time to put it back together. Here is the sear housing block, or rear frame rails, whatever you want to call it. Basically, when you get ready to put the trigger bar in, I couldn't come up with the right word, trigger bar in, it'll eventually sit, this little leg here will slide into this part of the sear block, and the arm part that interacts with the safety plunger will push on that little doodad and activate the sear, just like that. Now you're gonna basically put everything back in reverse of the way you took it out. So you start with the rear block, and I get it started. Make sure that this pin here is pushed all the way in, because it's a pin that just has a tendency to slide this way. Once I get it started, I will take the trigger and make sure your spring is still oriented correctly and spun the right way, and I'll drop the trigger in. But first you want to push that bar into that little slot and then drop the trigger in and then push the block all the way down. There you go, just like that. Next, you can put your slide lock release lever back in. Just push over on the trigger bar a little bit and it should just drop right back into place. It does have this little tab here that you want to depress out of the way, and it should kind of lock into place. Next, you want to make sure your takedown lever's in place and pointed downward, and then just make sure that everything is just kind of centered well, and then you can push the forward block down into place. Just like that. The next part is the trickiest part of the whole reassembly, and that is because you are dealing with, basically, you have to get this pin that has the flat head on one end. You're going to be inserting that from the left side of the frame, and it has to navigate its way through the frame, the forward rail block, the slide stop release lever, the trigger return spring, and then back through the other side. And so what I like to do is use a small punch from the right side and capture the edge of the spring and the trigger. And while I'm holding that spring on one side, I'm going to grab the pin and start pushing it in. It should go in by hand, essentially. And so slowly push that pin in and let it capture the trigger. So now it's captured. It's gone through the first 1, 2, 3 layers, 4 layers. And now it just has to get over the spring. And so what I'm gonna do is basically, while I have the spring captured with the punch, I'm going to work that spring up and over the pin, just like that. And then you should be able to just push it all the way through, mostly by hand, and then at the very end, you can grab your nylon punch and finish it off. Before you do your last 2 pins, you can activate the trigger, basically actuate the trigger. Make sure it is pushing on this little sear engagement arm doodad, and make sure the sear is rocking up and down. Make sure it's not binding on anything and that the trigger return spring is working as it should. Now I'm going to get my 2 frame pins, and these are identical, so you can use either one. I'm going to go from this side and basically just drive these pins in with my hammer, and they should just go in very, very easily. You shouldn't encounter much resistance. The forward one is a little harder than the rear, and once you get it most of the way on the forward pin, you can use just a punch to push it a little bit further in. And just like that, we are good to go. The frame is back together. Now we just have to see if everything works. Now I'm gonna put my X300U flashlight on here. I like to secure it with a penny. There we go. Now let's put the slide back on the frame. I'm gonna put a little oil on the frame rails And all right, let's give it a little wipe down. Test it out. Here we go. Oh, yeah. Here is the brake, the reset, brake. That is beautiful. I have my Lyman's electronic trigger pull gauge from Brownells. Let's see what this trigger pulls at. 2 pounds, 10.9 ounces. 3 pounds, 0.2 ounces. 3 pounds, 0.3 ounces. 3 pounds, 1.3 ounces for an average of 2 pounds, 15.2 ounces. What an exceptional trigger. Well, until this pistol gets slide work done by Floyd's Custom Shop, it is 100% done. So I guess that would make it like 90% done, or maybe 80 or 70, depending on how much emphasis you put on ports and slide work, which I actually put a high emphasis. So maybe I'll put it at 60% done. It already has the Surefire X300U on it and a Trijicon RMR. It has the Floyd's magwell and base pads for the magazine. This is obviously still safety checked and cleared. And now I have the Apex Flatty trigger on this thing. And I hope this video really helped you install your own. As I said before, this is not for the thumb safety version of this pistol where there's another step when you're working on that sear block. So if you have that iteration of the pistol, maybe you watch one of the other videos that has that thumb safety so that you make sure you install it properly and don't interfere with the safety features of this pistol. As always, remember, you have to work on your own firearms at your own risk. That is my liability statement, and I believe it dearly. These are definitely something that if you're not comfortable with, you want to send it out to a professional gunsmith, because the safety of these firearms is paramount and number one. I love this Apex trigger. I have it on every single one of my M&P 2.0 pistols, and I know you will love it too. Brownells has it for the cheapest around, and with the code FKF10, you can save another 10% on this trigger, and it will bring the price down even more. So hit up Brownells, buy one of these triggers, save extra money by using my code, install it using this video, and then go shoot the heck out of it. I love you guys. Thanks for watching. I hope this helped. Have a great day. Remember, faith kills fear. Keep the good vibes flowing. Thanks, guys.